This is the Kratom Science Journal Club with Dr. Jonathan Cachat, neuroscientist and expert in psychopharmacology. In each episode, we discuss an article in a peer-reviewed journal. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for KratomScience.com, your source for all things Kratom. This episode of Journal Club, we look at the pineal gland and DMT, fact versus myth. Look at a paper by legendary psychedelic researcher Dr. David Nichols. I watched the talk that he gave that this paper was, he said the paper was based on.
Inspired by, yeah.
Yeah. And I pulled some of the comments too, so we'll maybe go over them a little later because they're pretty funny. So people are really attached to the idea. But anyway, okay, so this is DMT and the pineal gland, separating fact from myth by David E. Nichols.
Him and his son are like all-stars in psychedelic research. He was the first one that we got the psychedelics from at Tulane to give to the zebrafish. Nichols was.
Oh, wow, cool. Yeah, I figured you knew who he was because I was just reading on his Wikipedia page. Worked in the field of psychoactive drugs since 1969. While he was a graduate student, he patented the method that is used to make the optical isomers of hallucinogenic amphetamines. Published 250 reports and book chapters describing the relationship between the structure of a molecule and its biological effects. Currently adjunct professor at UNC Eshelman School of Pharmacy, where I actually applied there, not because of the pharmacy, because there was jobs then. I would have been like office staff, but I ended up getting a job across the street at the School of Nursing. And so this paper, he goes over, there's like ancient myths about the pineal gland going back to the Egyptians, and then there's some more recent myths that have to do with that movie, The Spirit Molecule, or it was actually a book by Rick Strassman. But the old myths I was looking into, I mean, it's okay. Eye of Horus, the Egyptian god. He's an Egyptian god with a falcon head. But that's kind of all I got out of that. Descartes was another one, the philosopher. He called the pineal gland the seat of the soul and the place in which all of our thoughts are formed. I don't think that's scientifically sound. And even in this link from Stanford talking about Descartes and the pineal gland, he said some of Descartes' basic anatomical and physiological assumptions were totally mistaken, not only by our standards, but also in light of what was already known in his time. So there's a lot of myths surrounding the pineal gland, and I guess the claim that this paper's trying to rebut is that the gland produces enough endogenous DMT to explain out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences, and
it doesn't, right?
Yeah. So he's saying this is not true.
Goal was to his goal was essentially to evaluate if it's physiologically possible for you to get a threshold dose of DMT from your pineal gland. And, I think that overall, I think that he's pretty fair. I don't think that he's running at this like, this is completely wrong. What are you guys thinking? Like, he lays out a very methodical sort of, point by point assessment of whether or not DMT can be produced in concentrations that would be enough for you to feel it. And it's interesting. I mean, so we were talking about the myth in the last Journal Club. That's what got us here, that it gets released when you're born and when you die. I said that. This has been a myth for ages, for centuries. And so it's just interesting. But I think where he ends up with the kappa opiate receptors is pretty interesting as well.
Yeah. So the purpose of the pineal gland is the nighttime secretion of melatonin. He even mentioned that there's no serious side effects when the gland's actually removed in rats and humans. Is there any other purpose for melatonin other than, because we think of skin pigmentation?
Well, so you were talking about the penolectomized rats. I thought that was a pretty interesting word.
Yeah.
But you're confusing melatonin with melanin. Melanin is what,
okay.
Caught like variations in skin color. But yeah, so the pineal gland primarily makes melatonin, and we all know melatonin is like a supplement that you can take, and it's supposed to regulate your circadian rhythm. So like, when you sleep and when you are awake. But like you mentioned, when they took the pineal glands out of the rats, the rats without the pineal gland had the same amount of sleep, same amount of rapid eye movements, same sort of wavelengths and delta waves, and the rhythm amplitude. So essentially, taking out the pineal gland doesn't result in any sort of evidence that it is critical for these things. So it's interesting in that way. And one thing I wanted to mention real quick too, why there was so much interest in this, I thought it was interesting. In your brain, it's usually a mirror image either side. So like you got amygdala on the left, you got amygdala on the right. It's split down the middle, and you got the corpus callosum that connects the two. The pineal gland is maybe the only gland where there's only one, and I think that has something to do with the birth of these myths. It's sort of buried deep in your brain, and there's only one. There's not a pair of them, so they thought it was super important.
So it says the adult pineal gland weighs less than 0.2 of a gram. Its principal function is what did I just say? Its principal function is to produce about 30 micrograms per day of melatonin. And it says melatonin is a hormone that regulates circadian rhythm with interactions with melatonin receptors, so it's a hormone. There are minute concentrations of DMT in the brain, but he says they're not significant to produce psychoactive effects. So why are people so attached to the idea that there's enough DMT in your brain to trip on or have a near-death experience or something like that?
Yeah. So I was looking at the threshold dose for DMT. So to notice the effects, to be able to consciously notice the effects, is about 2 to 3 milligrams. So yeah, he goes through and discusses whether or not the pineal gland could actually even produce that much, given that it only produces, I can't see it exactly, but you're right, it's around like 30 milligrams or micrograms of the melatonin.
Yeah.
I think there's several reasons why people are holding on to this thought. I think the first one is that it's sort of like a security blanket, or it's information that you can expect. Like everybody wants to know what happens after you die. We've always wanted to know that, since humans were humans. And this provides a plausible mechanistic answer to reports that people see, like, that they saw the light or their light flash before them. And then when you're born, there's sort of this idea that you're coming out of the darkness into the light, and you're just sort of like activated. So I think people are using it as a bit of a comfort blanket. But I think it definitely started because of the anatomy of it. It was unique in that there was only one. There wasn't two that were mirrored on either side of the brain. So that's unlike any other part of the brain. So they have to explain that. And then I think that's where the third eye notion came from. I think they even said something like, they believe it was the third eye, but then it got sucked back into the head, and it's like a vestigial trait. But at one point it was an eye. And I thought that was pretty wild.
You mean at one point it was an eye? You mean like there was some kind of evolutionary thing where we were about to get a third eye?
Yes. But it's total myth. Myth.
Okay.
Like you mentioned that, like Egyptians thought it was literally a third eye that then got sucked back into the brain.
Oh, okay. That's what they thought.
Back then, all they had was anatomy to look at,
Yeah, and I was going to say they were already doing dissections, but mummies, so they were already messing with the body back then.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah.
Yep.
So there's this whole issue of some of the people that are arguing against him say that it's when the pineal gland calcifies, then I guess their argument is it would reach a point right before death that it releases all kinds of DMT. But so what is about calcification of the pineal gland and these claims about DMT? Is there any like experiment that show that a calcified gland produces more DMT?
So penile calcification essentially refers to like an increase of calcium in the pineal gland. And as an ion, calcium is involved in sort of the balance between the inside of the neuron and the outside of the neuron, and when a neuron fires. So I think that what they're trying to say with this pineal gland classification is essentially that once there's an overload of calcium ions in the pineal gland, there starts to be sort of like this wild behavior, like almost like you could imagine a seizure in the part of the motor cortex of your brain. So essentially when it gets destroyed or when it's calcified, the neuron firing is not regulated like it would be. And it could, presumably, or the hypothesis that would result in release of the DMT. And I think they said something for like 30 minutes, even after death, there's still activity there. But yeah, that's what they're saying. Calcification is like a major off-balance teeter-totter way that happens to the pineal gland, and perhaps that could lead to release of DMT that could cause threshold doses. That's what they're saying there. I don't know where you were going to go next, but I wanted to just talk about the enzymes.
Okay.
And the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Is that cool? Or
Yeah, definitely.
Get to that down the road?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So in order for something to be considered a neurotransmitter, there's a criterion in which they have to meet. They have to be produced within a neuron, so on the inside of it. They have to be found within a neuron. And then when the neuron is stimulated, it's released. And then once it's released, there's an enzyme that degrades it, and there's a receptor on the other side. So you got to hit all of those. Like dopamine is made in the neuron, it's held in synapses or synapsosomes, like little lipid bubbles. It goes to the edge of the neuron, it gets pushed outside, and then it causes a change on the next neuron down the line. And so one of the ways that we can assess whether or not something is a neurotransmitter or not is looking for the presence of enzymes that either are involved in making it or in degrading it. And I think most people are probably aware when you do ayahuasca, when you do DMT, and we mentioned this last week as well, but you usually take it with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. And that essentially blocks the enzyme that destroys the DMT once it gets in the synapse. So the monoamine oxidase very quickly degrades the DMT. It's not necessarily that monoamine oxidase also does dopamine, all of the catecholamines, but it's interesting how quickly DMT is removed. It's removed much faster than like serotonin and dopamine. And so they talk about the location of enzymes that are present in the body and the lungs. There's some studies that they did where they radioactively tagged it and then injected the radioactive tag, and then how they determined how long it took to get to the blood-brain barrier. And essentially, I think his conclusion is that it's not the way that these enzymes are located and how fast they degrade, and the fact that we don't know if the DMT is made in the neurons or outside of the neurons. There's no real bubbles of DMT that can be found in the neurons. That's sort of evidence that it's not necessarily a neurotransmitter or released at any point.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask that next about whether it's a neurotransmitter. So are there people claiming that it's a neurotransmitter?
So given its activity, consciously and behaviorally, the sort of drastic changes that occur once you consume DMT, that would lead one to just sort of believe or hypothesize right off the bat that that's a neurotransmitter. It's going in the body, it's going to the brain, and it's acting on receptors that are related to, consciousness, emotional processing, introspection. If it was a neurotransmitter, the argument that it is released from the pineal gland would be much stronger. And so one of the ways that we can deduce and sort of eliminate it, that the possibility is to go through that criterion. And, hormones would also be considered neurotransmitters with this criterion. It's a matter of sort of, is it a signaling molecule that sends a message to the next neuron down the line? And so that's why it's important to sort of determine, are there enzymes to make it? Are there enzymes to degrade it? Is it stored somewhere? When is it released, et cetera?
So if it's not a neurotransmitter, then what is the endogenous DMT then that we have trace amounts of?
That's a good question.
Yeah. I don't know if they answer it in the paper. But.
It says only trace amounts of DMT have been detected in any mammalian tissue, has led to the question of whether any process exists whereby endogenous DMT could somehow be concentrated to reach significantly high in vivo levels, the threshold levels. And so it can be a signaling molecule along the lines of hormones or, like cytokines. But the fact that it isn't made in the neurons and it's made at such low concentrations, you could maybe hypothesize that it's sort of like a byproduct when they're making serotonin and dopamine. It's just sort of like the enzyme messes up or something and then kicks out the DMT. Because there certainly doesn't seem to be like a specific production pathway for it. So I think you're right. I don't think we necessarily know whether or not it's a neurotransmitter or not. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, and they do offer, I think, alternative explanations for what's causing out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences. It says it could be the production of dynorphin and other endogenous opioid peptides. Accumulating evidence suggests that dynorphin is a cognate kappa opioid receptor, play an important role in regulating stress responsiveness, motivation, and motion. I guess that's one explanation. And even in the conclusion, he says more well-studied systems. Although the romantic notion that DMT is released from the pineal gland to produce altered states of consciousness at various times of stress is appealing to some, more well-studied systems provide more sound explanations for out-of-body experiences.
I think that in the way that was worded, essentially, he's giving a nod to the fact that like people are holding on to this for something like the safety blanket, like I was mentioning, like there's some comfort in the fact that it could be DMT. But you're right. So he says, okay, basically they do a number of studies and they show that DMT does bind to serotonin receptors. It binds to 5-HT2. Basically, all of the psychedelics bind to 5-HT2. There's 20 plus serotonin receptors, but it does bind there. In doing so, it then leads to changes in serotonin signaling. So, it can increase serotonin signaling, and that could be behind sort of where you're getting some of these experiences from. So that it's like a secondary effect. It blocks the reuptake SERT, so SSRIs block those. I think they were talking about DMT essentially reversing the serotonin reuptake transporter. So instead of it sucking serotonin out of the synapse into the neuron and lessening the effects of it, it's actually pushing the serotonin out because of differences in the electron balance, like I was saying with calcium earlier. So there is activity in the receptors that are certainly implicated in all of the psychedelics. But in the paper that we reviewed in the last episode, there was, I don't remember how many there were, but there are like 10 or 12 different, plants that had psychoactive compounds in it. And of all of those, salvia is the only one that binds to kappa, the kappa opiate receptor. So that would put DMT in the sort of same category as salvia. But I think that salvia is pretty concentrated just to the opioid system, while the DMT sort of hits that and the serotonin at the same time. Ultimately, we ran into the same problem with the psychedelics because you can very clearly, take an amphetamine and very clearly see that it's affecting the dopamine system. The dopamine levels are increased, and it binds, directly to that receptor. When it comes to the psychedelics, the serotonergic system and the serotonin receptors are so complex that we don't necessarily even have methods to tease apart, what psychedelics are working at what receptors, and how does that relate to the effects that they do. And, a lot of the stuff with the zebrafish, we were trying to make a model where you could explore that. The other interesting thing along that line with the serotonin is that if they block serotonin receptors, it doesn't change the behavioral aspects in the rats. So they give them DMT. They are more hypermotility, so they're moving around their cage a lot more. And if they block the dopamine receptors or the serotonin receptors and then give them the DMT, there's no change. They still continue to have the hypermotility. So it's not necessary. That would suggest that serotonin and dopamine receptors aren't necessary for the effects of the DMT because it didn't change the behavior. So it just, it's piling on complexities like, 10 pages of if-then statements, and we just lose track of it at some point because there's so many serotonin receptors and their downstream effects are so wild.
And there's a whole section on INMT. It's the key enzyme necessary for the biosynthesis of DMT. INMT is present throughout the body and has high expression in the lungs. So it says proponents of the theory of DMT is produced endogenously in significant amounts. This is one of their arguments, that since the INMT enzyme is all over the body, then that might be causing it. So I guess what is the argument against that?
They're saying that INMT is an enzyme that's involved in synthesizing or making endogenous DMT.
Yeah.
Where it starts to fall apart is that essentially this enzyme is found throughout the body, particularly in the lungs, but it's predominantly present in the peripheral tissues. So it's not really found in high concentrations in the nervous system or in the brain. And so because of that, like the main physiological function would essentially be non-neural, in the nervous system. So that's where it sort of falls apart. Yes, we do have the enzyme that can produce DMT in high concentrations throughout the body, but it's not in the brain.
And then there's a whole section about, can DMT be concentrated in the brain? So there, let me see. He quotes another paper that says there's evidence DMT is taken up into the synaptosomes and stored in vesicles by mechanisms identical to those described for known neurotransmitter substances. And Nichols points out there's no citation provided to support that contention, and no study has been reported to date to support that conclusion. And I would just think, a common sense, since the DMT trip experience only takes, people say, 10 or 15 minutes, then you couldn't really accumulate it in enough amounts naturally to have any effect.
Yeah. And so this is where they were talking about how quickly it gets transported into the nervous system.
Okay.
How quickly. So it's rather unique compared to other chemicals, other catecholamines, in that when you consume it, it does seem to it's not in the nervous system, but it gets to the nervous system very quickly, which would suggest there's some sort of like active mechanism that's doing that. It's going through the SERT receptors, it's hitting something where it's getting thrown into the neurons. So their hypothesis here is like, okay, maybe DMT isn't made in just the pineal gland, but there's enough of it made in your lungs and all over your body that it could get concentrated and then get released. If there's not proof that it's made in concentrations in the pineal gland, maybe it's getting accumulated over time and then is released in certain things, like when there's calcification or brain dead, essentially, without the neurons just firing sort of haphazardly. They also were talking about giving them MAOIs. And so they would give them the MAOIs, 2 hours before an experiment. And then they found that the DMT was readily passed through the blood-brain barrier, suggesting that DMT accumulation had the properties of an active uptake mechanism in the cortical parts of the rat brain. Usually compounds, especially ones that you consume exogenously, aren't like welcomed into your nervous system with a red carpet, but it seems like DMT is.
Yeah, and there's also this other, there's some talk about glutamate there. It's he has like a 6-point conclusion at the end, and he's talking about asphyxiation and cardiac arrest. It might be the explanation for the near-death experience. And he says asphyxia induces excessive release of the excitatory amino acid glutamate. Drugs such as ketamine, which also raise cortical glutamate, can produce out-of-body experiences.
Yeah, so glutamate is that primary excitatory neurotransmitter. So when it's released, it generally leads to the release of other neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. I think that the point about the asphyxiation and the cardiac arrest is pretty interesting in that when that occurs, so you lose oxygen or you have a heart attack, your brain activity spikes, it goes up. Marked increases in the neurotransmitters of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, the latter of which can stimulate that 5-HT2A, the hallucinogenic receptor. So I think that's sort of what Nichols is hinting at here. And I think I mentioned it earlier in that, like, maybe DMT is not the sort of the key that goes in the lock, but it, opens the door some other way. And then serotonin starts going crazy. That's a plausible explanation for its effects, because it, after it gets in the brain, we sort of like don't really know where it goes. It gets degraded really quickly. It can bind to some receptors, but more likely it leads to the excessive release of excitatory neurotransmitters.
And I've never read that book, The Spirit Molecule, or saw the documentary, but I'll have to check it out. I pulled some YouTube comments that were pretty funny. This one guy says, I would much rather hear this sort of education on it than some hippie telling me to follow gestures and watch out for dragonflies.
What?
This is on the YouTube comments. I think he was complimenting Nichols there. This is on his talk. I don't know what that means, but it was funny.
Sounds like he was on DMT.
Yeah. This other guy goes, we can't be too science-based because that's only viewing humans biologically. People have still failed to realize that, yes, we are physical beings. The life inside us is not physical. It's infinite. So if you think everyone's the same because we have the same biology, think again. We have very different souls that will go on forever, even when we are 6 foot under. Expand the mind, don't reject.
Yeah, that happens quite a lot in neuroscience. It gets critiqued for being too mechanistic, trying to say that everything is related to, change the chemical sort of balances in your brain, which is true. But it is also true that your environment affects that as well, if not more, just the same. So they have a point there, but it's interesting. Like when you get into the cannabis space and now in the psychedelic space, there's so much social sort of taboo or sort of, myths and rumors about it. And people have had experiences that, dramatically changed their life or maybe helped them, get over something and sort of allow them to forgive themselves. And so they don't necessarily want to be told, well, it's just because it binding your serotonin 2A dissolved your ego and you were able to like talk to yourself in a different way. They think it's more than that. And given the sort of literally magical effects of some of these hallucinogens, you can't blame them, I think, for holding on to that.
Yeah.
But of course, the answer is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like Shane Moss, he's completely like science-based, and he's done TMT so many times, but he's like, he was saying, well, when you smoke it, and a couple days after, all these things seem real to you, and then you kind of come down, and if you're interested at all, then you'll look at the actual science behind this, and yeah, any like I went into the LSD experience thinking, I was going to see God and all that stuff, and if anything, it made me more of an atheist, because I was just like, I wasn't like, oh, I met God. I was more like, what the fuck just happened to my brain? That was weird.
Yeah, God is everywhere. God is everything. It's true. It's and unfortunately, sort of pop culture and those social taboos, in movies, like I would say the majority of people literally think if you take LSD, you're going to see like a pink elephant, like just see things that are not there.
Yeah.
And that's just not the case. That's not the case with mushrooms or LSD. I think it goes to show you how well the federal government sort of scared the shit out of everybody.
Yeah, really.
When DMT gets in the mix, like, people say that they literally feel like they're going to another sort of realm. And like I mentioned last week, there are similarities from trip to trip to trip, whereas with the other psychedelics, it's more sort of reliant on the environment, sort of how the experience goes. Whereas DMT, it sort of doesn't matter where you're at. You're going to take the hit, you're going to like fall back, and then you're going to be gone for a little bit, and then you'll come back. It is wild. And I think it's wild. I mean, we all know serotonin sort of modifies a lot of brain behavior, but with the opiate system, there's only 3 receptors. 2 of them are involved in pain. Why would this third one, this kappa, be involved in modulating sort of your conscious experience? I don't think we have answers to that.
They point to how small the endogenous amounts are, and is it kind of along lines, because homeopathy is like a kind of a pseudoscience that says if you get trace amounts of something and dilute it with a million gallons of water, you'll still get the effects. I wonder if that's kind of along the lines of, since there's trace amounts of DMT, then it must be still actively doing something.
Much like some background noise or something. There's a huge push for microdosing of psychedelics at this point. It's pretty mainstream. I was surprised at the Elon Musk SNL last week or this weekend. He mentioned mushrooms during that Mario skit. Like, it's just everybody's talking about mushrooms now.
Yeah.
But with not necessarily with mushrooms, but with LSD and DMT, we're talking about micrograms, like nanograms. It's such low concentrations that cause these sort of drastic effects. So the idea that maybe there's not 2 milligrams that are pushed out from your pineal gland when you're born and when you die, but it is all over your body. It's got to be there for some reason. Like maybe it could be that it's just a byproduct of an enzymatic activity, but given that when you take enough of it, you get sort of transported, I think there's merit to hypothesizing that it could just be sort of background noise, but with no sort of negative connotations to that. Just sort of in the background, keeping things going while serotonin and dopamine are running the show.
Is Nichols, they say, I think on his Wikipedia, they say he's kind of still working, but he officially retired in 2012, but he's still working because there's really nobody else doing the same thing that he's doing. Is that true?
Yeah. I mean, the only person that's doing it. So David has a son named Charles. Charles was at LSU, Louisiana State University, which is right down the block from Tulane Medical School, where I went. And so He's doing it. His son is doing it. And they're doing it on fruit flies. But yeah, when we first tried to get LSD or psilocybin from the DEA, because we had the DEA license, we actually went over and talked to Charles about it first to just get the down low on how it was, because essentially, there are not very many labs, maybe less than 20 labs that are that have a DEA license and are able to investigate and try to untangle this situation.
Yeah.
I mean, we're really pursuing the fundamentals of consciousness at this point, right? It's the final frontier is figuring out how all these serotonin receptors sort of in concert with all the other chemicals allow us to have consciousness and thoughts and etc. So yeah, there's not a lot, but I think that with the public interest growing more and people sort of getting good therapeutic benefits, it's real good that we're going back and looking at these things, because the artificial, fully synthetic ones that are the pharmaceuticals now just aren't as effective. They're just sort of like throwing a dart at the wall, hoping they hit the dartboard, and 50% of the time they hit the dartboard, 50% of the time they don't.
I mean, I know we're talking about mushrooms and LSD and therapy again, but I don't even know if is there any talk about using DMT in like a therapeutic setting?
I think ayahuasca. I don't know.
Yeah, that's true.
How you would describe therapeutic in that, like, you can go to places and a shaman helps you. You're not going to the psychiatric institute at the Cleveland Clinic. You're sort of going a little bit more homeopathic. So I don't think like MDMA has certainly made it into psychologist offices where people will take MDMA and then sort of stay in the room while the psychologist or the psychiatrist is there with them, sort of probing them and leading them to different places. We're not there with DMT, and I don't know if we will ever be there, given that given that the effects are you like feel like you disappeared and you're just sort of like in another realm. I don't know necessarily how you could how anybody could help you use that in a therapeutic way. It's sort of like a soul quest of the the young men becoming men out in the woods by themselves. You got to figure it out yourself.
It's kind of weird. I don't even know that I'd want to like trip in a doctor's office. I'd really have to trust the psychiatrist or whoever would be in place of the shaman. But
for sure, doctor. Within 30 minutes, I'd be wanting to go outside.
Yeah,
you want me to sit here? No, thanks. I gotta move. I'm ready to move.
Really. And Carl Hart in his book said he thought it was creepy.
I mean, it kind of is. It's interesting. I've looked into there's qualifications and like certifications that PhDs can get to open up like MDMA therapy or psilocybin therapy. And I'm with you. And I sort of describe the same thing with cannabis, where like, we weren't necessarily introduced to cannabis as medical cannabis when we were growing up. The kids now, it's not something that you get behind the convenience store. Like it's considered a medicine, and you can buy it at an establishment that sells it, right? And so because of that, I feel like the people that have always seen cannabis as a therapeutic compound get more therapeutic benefits from it than people who were sort of exposed and grew up with cannabis as sort of like a drug that needed to be hidden, and the paranoia and everything. Psychopharmacology 101, set and setting. And so the set is different for cannabis. And so I think that your thoughts going into it, especially with the DMT or the MDMA, certainly have a lot to do with what you get out of it. But I'm with you. I don't want to do it inside sitting in a chair with I think they put a mask over you, like a sleeping mask over your face, and it just seems weird. That or like doing it in a float tank. I don't know if I'd like that either. I don't like the idea of being confined.
Yeah, I'll try a float tank under the influence of nothing, but I don't want to add stuff that could possibly induce severe paranoia.
Let me just see.
Also, I'd look at the doctor's magazines. If he has those usually shitty magazines in the waiting room, I'm not going to take acid in his office if he likes People magazine. So
Men's Health from 1992.
Yeah. Maybe it depends on how good the reading material is in the office. And the music is Moonrunner by Captain Big Wheel. Thank you, Dr. John Cachat, for walking me through this. It's melatonin, not melanin. Check Dr. Jonathan Cachat out at jcachat on social media. Kratom Science Journal Club is produced by Brian Gallagher, that's me, for KratomScience.com. Take care.